Hi everyone, Ed here from Bring Back the Memory. Today we're going to continue with our series of videos about collecting stock certificates for enjoyment and profit. Okay, now I'd like to remind you that we already have some videos that we made, and two in particular are how to find the value of stock certificates. One is how to determine the value of stock certificates, and the second one is how to actually look up the value of individual stock certificates using price guides, completed auctions, etc. Now, those videos are a couple of years old, but I looked at them and the information is still up to date. So, I'd remind you, look at those videos as far as for finding values. Okay, now today we're going to talk about a special industry, and a lot of people collect certificates by the industry. Now, the most popular industry is by far the railroad industry. People really like trains and the history of locomotives and trains. Okay, the second leading industry is mining. And again, in the United States, the history of mining is very important and people like to collect certificates on mining. Today we're going to talk about an industry that's also very popular, and that is the automotive industry. And here in the United States, people really love their cars and trucks. So I think you'll find that today's video is going to be very interesting. Okay, so here we go. First, I'd like to remind a little bit about the history of the automotive field in the United States. The first cars were actually made in the late 1800s and about 1895. Now, as soon as the first car was made, people immediately decided, hey, this is a thing of the future. When you look at the way things were then, and then the thought of being able to travel long distances much faster than you could before, everybody thought, boy, that's really great. And everybody would think, wouldn't it be great to have a car? So right off the bat, you had several really smart people, inventors, people who own small businesses, trying to come up with ways of making cars, okay? Now, the first thing that comes to mind, or the first person, is Henry Ford. And in 1896, Ford built his car, the quadricycle. And the quadricycle was basically, it was motorized, and it was like a car. It had a two-cylinder engine, and it was on bicycle wheels. But it actually drove like a car, and he made it, drove it around, and decided, hey, this is going to work. So he spent the next couple of years tinkering with it, improving it, changing the parts from, say, wooden to metal, and then he kept working on it for a while. Then in the 1900s, about 1906, he decided that he would start making cars commercially, okay? Meanwhile, there were other people who made cars, but the cars were very expensive and they were one of a kind. So the only way that you could get a car would be if you had quite a bit of money, because they were expensive to make and they took quite a while before you could make them. Also, road conditions back then were not like they were right now. I mean, you had bumpy roads, dirt roads, in some cases no roads at all. So you had to take that into consideration, okay? So at first, only rich people could afford to own cars. But again, in 1906, Ford started building cars using an assembly line, and he made his company, and he started making cars by using the similar parts, hiring workers that would put the parts together, and that made it much more efficient, and he was able to produce cars much more cheaply. And pretty soon, people were able to buy, the average American was able to buy a car. Now, General Motors, for the most part, they were given credit for something else that made it possible for people to own cars, and that was credit. They allowed you to buy a car by putting a small down payment down and paying for the car as you drove it. Now, if you put those two together, the assembly line and credit, you had a way for the average American to be able to drive a car. And basically that was all you needed, and that began the history of cars. So the car industry took off, and from there on in, more and more cars were built, and it kept getting more and more, and there were a few bumps in the roads. In 1929, for example, there was a depression, and that kind of put a crimper on the industry in the United States, and so they didn't produce as many cars. And then in the 1940s, we had World War II. And in World War II, the industry in the United States was dedicated towards the war effort, and car production, for the most part, commercial cars stopped, and they were building, the car companies were building military equipment, okay? So then, but for the most part, the car industry profited, and things changed a little bit. By the 1950s, a lot of these smaller companies closed down, and what you had was you had the big three of the automotive industry, and the big three consisted of Ford, and Ford made Ford cars. They made Lincoln and Mercury. You had General Motors. General Motors made Cadillacs, Oldsmobiles, Buicks, Pontiacs, and Chevys. And then you had Chrysler Corporation, and Chrysler made Chrysler cars, Plymouth cars, and Dodge cars and trucks, okay? So for the most part, Americans, they bought one of those. Now, not always, because there still were some other companies that were in business, but most of the cars that people bought were bought from the big three. And each of those companies produced luxury cars, which were much more expensive, and then economy models, which were the cheaper models that the average person could buy. So basically, that encompasses the history of cars up to the present. Now, those big three companies still exist, but now we have some changes. We have electric cars, and so people are still driving gasoline motor cars, but they're also driving electric cars. And now you even have the cars that drive themselves, the Tesla cars. Now, whether they're going to work, we don't know yet, but they exist. And so the history of cars continues, but people still love their cars, okay? So now we're going to switch from history to actually collecting certificates, stock certificates of cars and trucks, okay? Now, why would people want to do that? Well, there's many reasons. The first thing is for enjoyment. Now, I'm sure just about everybody can think of something a good memory of their first car, or maybe getting their driver's license for the first time. A lot of people, they didn't have a car at first, maybe they drove their parents' car, and they could think of times, good times that they had with their friends in cars and stuff like that. And I'm sure a lot of people could think of how it was to buy their first car, how much they loved their first car, maybe going out and cleaning it and doing things like that. Everybody loved their first car. And so I'm sure everybody has a personal story. I have a story that maybe you might be interested in, and I am pretty old. So I'm going to go back to my sophomore year in college up in Maine, and I bought a car for $100. It was a 1939 Buick Roadmaster. And it was a great looking car, looked really good, black, very, very glossy. It ran fairly well, not too great, but it ran okay. It was only $100, but I really enjoyed that car. And I remember just driving it. Here's a funny story is, back in the college days, very few of us had much money. And on weekends when there was nothing else to do, sometimes we'd go to a drive-in movie. And I remember taking some of my friends, and the drive-in movie would charge by the person. And so I'd have somebody sitting on the side in the front seat, and then we had maybe one or two people sitting in the trunk. So then we drove to into the movie theater, and of course, once we got in, the people in the trunk came out and sat in the back seat. So we were able to save a little bit of money by doing that. And I'm sure that people have similar stories of things that they did. Okay. Now, also, another thing that shows how much people enjoy their cars, they have car shows. Now it's the spring coming up, and there are a lot of car shows throughout the country. People love going to the car shows, listening to the old music, and seeing examples of the old cars from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and all the way through, okay? And then finally, the last thing that we're going to talk about are the certificates themselves. The enjoyment of collecting, and these are collecting the certificates. Now, the certificates themselves create enjoyment. Some people collect them for the artwork, and many of the certificates from the car companies, they have really nice metallically engraved vignettes of some of the old cars and trucks, and just for the certificates alone, people would collect them. They like to display them, put them on a shelf, maybe hang them on a wall, mat them, frame them, and just show them off, talking about cars that they own or cars that they like. Okay, so so those are some of the reasons why people would want to collect stock certificates, and that would be for enjoyment. But another big reason why people would want to collect stock certificates, and this goes for auto stocks or any kind of stock, and that would be for profit. And so basically, anytime we talk about certificates, we're always going to bring in the profit factor and why people and use that as one of the reasons why people would collect them. Now, the first thing, like I said, we have those videos that you can look at that show how to determine the value of a certificate. But what you have to remember is a couple things. Number one, these certificates, they're not worth anything. You can't trade them in. If you have 100 shares of General Motors, you can't trade it in for the value of 100 shares of General Motors. Their value is only as a collectible. Okay, so it's whatever the collectible is worth, not what the shares are worth. So now, and the other thing is, no matter what the price guide says, or no matter what the completed auctions say, all collectibles are based on supply and demand, and they're only worth what somebody is willing to pay for them at a given time. Okay, so that's something that you have to remember. So you can't look at a certificate and say, this is worth $200, because if somebody really wants it, it might be worth $300. If nobody wants it, it's not worth $100, okay? So collectibles, the price of collectibles go up and down based on supply and demand, right? Now, here's another thing that you have to think about, and that's rarity, how rare a certificate is. And here's a little story, and for people who are already collecting certificates, you would already know this. If you're not a collector, this is something that you'll find out very soon, and that is that General Motors certificates are very easy to come by. They're very common, and it's a really nice certificate. It's something that you'd like to have. There's a really nice vignette of the different cars. But the thing was, many of these certificates got out on the market, and so they're relatively common, and they can be bought for a few dollars. Now, if you compare that to Ford certificates, now you would think that would be the same, because Ford and Chevy are both pretty comparable when you can consider their cars. Usually the prices are about the same. People are either like Chevy fans, they love their Chevys, or they love their Fords, but basically, they're considered about the same, price-wise and things like that. But the thing about Ford, this was company policy. So if you bought Ford, let's say you bought shares in the Ford Corporation, you received a stock certificate, let's say for 100 shares of certificate, or 100 shares of Ford ownership in Ford Corporation. But when you traded that in, the company policy was to destroy the certificate. So you traded it in by giving it to a broker. The broker gave you the money that it was worth. The broker then turned it into Ford Corporation, and they destroyed them. So because they destroyed all of their certificates, they're much more rare than, say, the General Motors. So when you go to try to buy a Ford certificate, you're going to find that you're going to have to pay quite a bit more than for a General Motors. Now, for other companies, it varies. Some of the companies are fairly common, and you can find their certificates and get them at a fairly reasonable price. Others could be very expensive. And some companies, there are very few, if any, certificates that are available, because some of these companies, they just closed down, and basically that was it. All the certificates were destroyed, and there weren't any more available. Okay, so they fall into one of those categories, and that would be one of the things that determine how much you would have to pay for a certificate. The last thing to consider is some certificates have signatures of famous people. Now, not very many, but if you can find a signature, let's say something that was signed by Henry Ford, you would have something that's worth a lot of money. Okay, so always be on the lookout for signatures of famous people, because if you can find something like that, you have something that's really worth quite a bit of money. Okay, so that just about wraps up the reasons for collecting certificates of from the automotive industry. What are some of the things that you should look for? Hopefully, you'll find it enjoyable. I always do. I mean, I love collecting stock certificates. It's my favorite collectible, which is why we make those videos. We have a website, Bring Back the Memory, and we also have a couple shops at a few antique malls. We have one in Milford, Pennsylvania, and we have one in Lafayette, New Jersey. So, if you're in the area, come visit our shop, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll be making more videos in the future, and hopefully you'll get to watch them, and you'll also get to collect stock and bond certificates. Okay, see you in the next video.